There exists a truth so disturbing, so revolutionary, that for 2 millennia, it has been kept in absolute silence. A truth that, if fully revealed, could transform everything you believe about Christianity, about faith, and about the role of women in sacred history. Imagine for a moment, what if I told you that somewhere in France, protected by millennia-old traditions and guarded by communities who risked their lives to preserve it, there exists something that directly connects our era to the earliest days of Christianity? Something so sacred, so spiritually powerful, that its mere existence challenges official narratives that have been constructed over centuries. Have you ever wondered why Mary Magdalene, one of Jesus's closest figures, virtually disappeared from official history? Why a woman whom the Gnostic Gospels call the beloved disciple, she who knew the all, was reduced to a mere footnote in the traditional Christian narrative? The answer to these questions is shrouded in a mystery that spans continents and millennia. A mystery involving sacred relics, hidden manuscripts, secret communities, and an extraordinary journey of spiritual preservation that challenges our understanding of what truly happened in the early centuries of Christianity. Ancestral traditions preserved in remote monasteries speak of something extraordinary, the physical preservation of elements that connect our time directly with Mary Magdalene. We are not talking about legends or myths, but carefully guarded traditions, documented in ancient manuscripts, and preserved by communities who considered their mission more important than their own lives. Modern academic studies on early Christianity reveal a reality very different from what we have been taught. Archaeological discoveries in the Mediterranean, analyses of Gnostic texts found in Nag Hammadi, and research into oral traditions preserved in isolated communities paint a picture where Mary Magdalene was not merely a follower, but a spiritual leader of extraordinary importance. But here is what is most unsettling. If these traditions are correct, if the ancient manuscripts that survived systematic destruction are true, then there is something physical, something tangible that has survived 2,000 years of attempted erasure. Something that represents not only the memory of Mary Magdalene, but the continuous spiritual presence of her mission throughout the centuries. Communities in southern France, direct descendants of the early Christians who fled persecution in the Eastern Mediterranean, preserve traditions that speak of a sacred guardianship, a responsibility passed down from generation to generation through wars, persecutions, crusades, and revolutions, a mission that transcended religious denominations, political borders, and social transformations. What you're about to discover in this video is not a conspiracy theory, but a careful investigation based on documented traditions, academic analyses, and archaeological discoveries that point to a much richer and more complex reality than the official narrative allows us to know. Do you feel that inner restlessness, that feeling that there is something deeper, truer waiting to be discovered on your spiritual journey? What we are about to explore today may be exactly the key you have been looking for to understand not only history, but your own connection with the sacred. Prepare for a journey that goes beyond conventional history, a journey that connects the latest discoveries in biblical archaeology with spiritual traditions that were never completely erased. A journey that can transform not only your knowledge, but your understanding of what it means to seek spiritual truth in our day. Because what you are about to discover about Mary Magdalene and the extraordinary preservation of her physical memory through the centuries may be the most important revelation you have ever encountered in your spiritual quest. For centuries, a specific version of Mary Magdalene's story was carefully constructed and maintained. A version that presents her as a repentant sinner, a marginal figure who found redemption through Jesus, but careful analyses of ancient texts, Gnostic manuscripts, and preserved traditions reveal a completely different reality. The Gnostic Gospels, discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt in 1945, present Mary Magdalene in a radically different way. In the Gospel of Mary, she appears as a spiritual leader who received special teachings from Jesus. In the Gospel of Philip, she is described as she whom Jesus loved more than all the disciples. These are not modern inventions, but texts dating from the first centuries of Christianity. Academic studies on the development of early Christianity show that there was a deliberate change in the narrative about women leaders in the first Christian communities. Researchers specializing in ancient history document how female figures of leadership were systematically diminished or reinterpreted as the institutional structure of the Church became established. Traditions preserved in Eastern Christian communities, which maintained greater independence from Roman conciliar decisions, always preserved a different view of Mary Magdalene. In these traditions, she is not just a disciple, but an apostola apostolorum, the apostle of the apostles. Ancient Syriac and Coptic manuscripts refer to her with titles of spiritual authority, rarely attributed to women in the official narrative. But why would this change have occurred? Historical analyses suggest that as Christianity became institutionalized and adapted to the social structures of the Roman Empire, there was pressure to conform to the patriarchal standards of the time. The presence of prominent female leaders in foundational history became problematic for a structure seeking legitimacy within the Roman system. What is even more significant is that oral traditions preserved in remote regions of France, especially in Provence, have always maintained a different version of Mary Magdalene's story. These traditions speak not only of her spiritual importance, but of her physical journey to these regions after the events in Jerusalem. Medieval documents from Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries in France contain references to much older traditions about Mary Magdalene's presence in that region, not as a temporary visitor, but as someone who established a spiritual continuity that persisted through the centuries. Recent archaeological discoveries at sites associated with these traditions have revealed elements that suggest continuous veneration long before the official narratives established by the Church. Cult structures, symbols and artifacts that point to traditions of preservation that transcend conventional historical versions. The most intriguing aspect is that these traditions do not speak only of Mary Magdalene's memory, but of a physical preservation, of a sacred guardianship that has been maintained through all historical transformations, all persecutions, all political and religious changes of the last 2 millennia. If you feel that you are beginning to awaken to truths that have always been there, waiting to be discovered, this is just the beginning of our journey together. Subscribe to this channel because here we build a community of sincere seekers of truth, people who are not afraid to question, to investigate, to go beyond superficial narratives. Activate the notification bell because each video is another piece in this millennial puzzle that we are assembling together. You are not alone in this quest. Ancestral traditions preserved in medieval manuscripts and transmitted orally through generations tell an extraordinary story about what happened to Mary Magdalene after the events in Jerusalem. A story that, if true, explains not only her enduring influence, but also how physical elements of her presence could have been preserved through the millennia. According to ancient Provençal traditions, documented in 12th century texts but clearly based on much older traditions, Mary Magdalene did not remain in the Middle East after the crucifixion and resurrection. Along with other close followers of Jesus, she would have embarked on a journey that would take her across the Mediterranean to the coasts of what is now southern France. These traditions, preserved in communities that considered themselves direct guardians of this memory, speak of a journey that was not only physical, but spiritual, a mission of preservation that went far beyond simply fleeing persecution. Mary Magdalene would have carried with her not only the teachings received from Jesus, but also physical elements that represented a direct connection with those early days of Christianity. Analyses of ancient first-century trade routes show that the journey described in these traditions was not only possible, but common at the time. The Mediterranean was a route of intense communication, and Jewish communities already established along the French Mediterranean coast provided support points for religious refugees coming from the east. Manuscripts preserved in the Abbey of Saint-Maximin in Provence contain references to traditions about Mary Magdalene's establishment in that region, not as a simple refugee, but as a spiritual leader who continued her mission of teaching and preservation. These documents, although copied in later periods, refer to much older sources and a continuity of veneration that suggests uninterrupted traditions. What makes these traditions even more significant is that they are not limited to spiritual or devotional aspects. Ancient texts preserved in monasteries in the region make specific reference to physical elements that would have been carefully guarded, not as mere symbolic relics, but as real presences that maintained a direct connection with the early days of the Christian mission. Local communities in Provence, especially around Saint-Baume and Saint-Maximin, have preserved oral traditions that complement and confirm written records. These traditions speak of a sacred guardianship that was passed down through specific family lineages, a responsibility that transcended political changes, wars, and religious transformations. Archaeological discoveries in the region have revealed evidence of very ancient Christian occupation, predating the official dates established by conventional history. Cult structures, early Christian symbols and artifacts that suggest an organized and continuous Christian presence since the first centuries of the Christian era. Modern research on Mediterranean oral traditions shows that isolated communities have managed to preserve historical information with surprising accuracy through carefully structured oral transmission. What may initially seem like legend often contains verifiable historical cores through archaeological and documentary methods. The most intriguing aspect of these traditions is that they specify not only Mary Magdalene's presence in the region, but also the preservation methods used to maintain physical elements of her presence throughout the centuries. Methods that involved conservation knowledge that we have only recently begun to understand through modern science. Documented traditions speak of special preservation techniques that would have been used to keep physical elements in suitable conditions through climate changes, wars, and other historical disturbances. Techniques that suggest sophisticated knowledge of conservation that goes far beyond what would be expected from medieval communities. Manuscripts from Benedictine monasteries contain references to secretum sanctum, a sacred secret that was transmitted only to specifically chosen guardians prepared for this responsibility, a tradition of guardianship that created an unbroken line of preservation through all the historical transformations of the last 2 millennia. Recent archaeological discoveries in the Provence region have revealed evidence that confirms many aspects of the preserved traditions about Mary Magdalene's presence in southern France. Excavations at sites associated with ancient traditions show Christian occupation much earlier than the dates conventionally accepted by official archaeology. Stratigraphic analyses in Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume have revealed layers of occupation dating from the 1st to 2nd centuries CE. Artifacts found in these layers include early Christian symbols, cult structures, and objects of veneration that suggest an established and organized Christian community much earlier than conventional history documents for this region. Studies of ancient manuscripts preserved in monastic libraries of the region reveal consistent references to preservation traditions dating back to the 1st centuries of Christianity. The Saint Victor manuscript, dated to the 9th century but clearly based on much older sources, contains detailed descriptions of preservation practices involving physical elements considered sacred. Academic research on early Christianity in the Western Mediterranean shows that the Provence region was a significant center of Christian activity much earlier than traditionally believed. Analyses of trade routes and migration patterns of the 1st century confirm that the journey described in the traditions about Mary Magdalene was not only possible, but probable within the historical contexts of the time. Gnostic texts analyzed by specialists in early Christianity contain specific references to Mary Magdalene's special role in preserving teachings and sacred elements. The Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and other ancient texts suggest that she had a specific responsibility related to the physical preservation of early Christian tradition aspects. Discoveries in sacred caves of the Sainte-Baume region have revealed evidence of continuous use for spiritual practices over nearly 2 millennia. Geological and archaeological analyses show that these caves were modified and consistently used by Christian communities since the 1st centuries of the Christian era. Studies on ancient preservation techniques show that communities in the Eastern Mediterranean possessed sophisticated knowledge about the conservation of organic materials. Methods documented in Egyptian papyri and Syriac manuscripts describe techniques that allowed the preservation of physical elements for extraordinarily long periods. Modern analyses of oral traditions preserved in isolated communities in Provence reveal surprising consistencies with independent archaeological discoveries. Information transmitted orally through generations often corresponds to physical evidence found in recent excavations, suggesting that these traditions preserved real historical information. Research on early Christian relics shows that the preservation of physical elements associated with sacred figures was a common and sophisticated practice in the first Christian communities. Documented methods included special conservation techniques that allowed the maintenance of organic materials over extensive periods. Syriac and Coptic manuscripts contain references to special preservation practices specifically associated with Mary Magdalene. These texts, some dating from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, describe specific responsibilities related to the guardianship of physical elements considered sacred by the early Christian community. Discoveries in Benedictine monasteries in the region have revealed special preservation chambers built with techniques that demonstrate advanced knowledge of humidity, temperature, and other essential long-term conservation factors. These structures suggest a continuous preservation tradition that spanned centuries. Scientific analyses of artifacts found in contexts associated with Mary Magdalene traditions show evidence of conservation techniques that were very advanced for the periods in which they were supposedly implemented, methods that we have only recently begun to understand through modern conservation science. I need to know, have you ever had an experience in your spiritual life where you felt you were touching something much older and deeper than it seemed on the surface? A moment where you realized there were layers of truth waiting to be discovered. Share your personal experience with spiritual discoveries that changed your perspective in the comments. Your journey is also part of this great network of awakening that we are exploring together. The veneration of sacred relics in early Christianity was much more than simple symbolic devotion. Academic studies on religious practices of the first centuries show that Christian communities considered physical elements associated with sacred figures as real presences, tangible bridges between the earthly world and spiritual reality. Ancient manuscripts preserved in Eastern monasteries describe specific practices related to the preservation and veneration of sacred physical elements. These practices were not casual or superstitious, but followed carefully developed protocols that involved sophisticated knowledge of conservation and spirituality. Documented traditions about Mary Magdalene speak of a special guardianship that went beyond the common preservation of relics. Medieval texts based on much older sources describe a sacred responsibility that involved not only physical preservation, but also the maintenance of a continuous spiritual connection through the centuries. Research on early Christian symbolism reveals that the head or skull had special spiritual significance in the mystical traditions of the first centuries. It represented not only the seat of thought, but also the point of connection between human consciousness and divine reality. This symbology appears consistently in Gnostic texts and esoteric Christian traditions. Monastic communities in southern France developed specific guardianship traditions that involved specialized knowledge transmitted only to specifically prepared guardians. Manuscripts from Cistercian monasteries contain references to guardiani secreti, secret guardians who had specific responsibilities related to the preservation of sacred elements. Analyses of ancient mummification and preservation techniques show that communities in the Eastern Mediterranean possessed sophisticated methods for conserving organic materials. Techniques documented in Egyptian medical papyri and Syriac texts describe processes that allowed extraordinarily durable preservation. Oral traditions preserved in communities in Provence speak of specific veneration practices that involved direct contact with sacred physical elements. These practices, transmitted through specific family lineages, included renewal rituals that maintained both physical preservation and spiritual connection. Archaeological discoveries in ancient crypts of the region have revealed special preservation structures that demonstrate advanced knowledge of conservation. Chambers with humidity, temperature, and air circulation control that allowed long-term preservation of delicate organic materials. Studies on Christian mystical traditions show that the preservation of physical elements associated with sacred figures was considered a way to maintain an active spiritual presence, not as dead objects, but as continuous points of connection with the spiritual energy of the sacred person. Gnostic manuscripts contain specific references to Mary Magdalene's special role in the tradition of sacred preservation. The Gospel of Mary and other ancient texts suggest that she had specific responsibilities related to the maintenance of physical elements that represented spiritual continuity. Documented traditions speak of renewal practices that were performed periodically to maintain both the physical preservation and the spiritual energy associated with the sacred elements. These practices involved knowledge that combined conservation techniques with specific spiritual rituals. Communities that preserved these traditions developed protection networks that transcended political changes, wars, and persecutions, a guardianship structure that ensured continuity regardless of external historical transformations. Research on preservation practices in medieval monasteries shows that Benedictine and Cistercian monks possessed extraordinarily advanced knowledge of conservation. Methods that included the use of natural substances, environmental control, and techniques that we have only recently begun to understand through modern science. Analyses of comparative traditions show that similar practices of sacred preservation existed in other Eastern Christian traditions, suggesting that specific methods of physical guardianship were an integral part of early Christianity, later lost or suppressed by Western institutionalization. For nearly 2 millennia, a silent network of guardians preserved traditions and physical elements that connect our era directly with the earliest days of Christianity, a guardianship that transcended wars, persecutions, revolutions, and social transformations, remaining faithful to a mission considered more important than the individual lives of the guardians themselves. Medieval manuscripts preserved in Benedictine monasteries in Provence contain references to custodes silenti, guardians of silence, men and women who accepted the responsibility of preserving specific elements through methods transmitted orally from generation to generation, creating an unbroken line of guardianship through the centuries. Documented traditions show that this guardianship was not casual or disorganized, but followed carefully structured protocols. Each guardian was prepared through years of training that included not only physical preservation techniques, but also spiritual preparation to understand the sacred responsibility they were assuming. Research on medieval monastic communities reveals that some monasteries were specifically established or chosen as preservation centers for elements considered especially sacred. These institutions developed specialized expertise in conservation that went far beyond the conventional practices of the time. Analyses of preserved oral traditions show that the transmission of knowledge about sacred guardianship followed specific methods that ensured accuracy across generations. Memorization techniques, cross-referencing, and redundant transmission ensured that critical information was not lost over time. During periods of religious persecution, especially during the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, this network of guardians developed sophisticated methods of protection and concealment. Sacred elements were transferred between safe locations, using routes and methods that remained secret even under torture or threat of death. Inquisition documents, ironically, provide indirect evidence of the existence of this guardianship network. References to secret sectarians and keepers of forbidden relics suggest that ecclesiastical authorities were aware of the existence of preservation traditions operating outside the official control of the Church. Family traditions preserved in rural communities in Provence speak of specific lineages that maintained hereditary responsibilities related to sacred guardianship. Families who, through generations, preserved knowledge and responsibilities that were transmitted only to members deemed adequately prepared. Analyses of correspondence between medieval monasteries reveal coded references to transfers of special elements during periods of instability. Codes and symbolic language that allowed communication about guardianship matters without revealing specific information that could compromise security. Research on monastic architecture shows that some monasteries in the region were built or modified with special preservation structures, underground chambers with features that demonstrate advanced knowledge of environmental control for long-term conservation. Documented traditions speak of periodic meetings between guardians, secret gatherings where knowledge was shared, techniques were updated, and the continuity of guardianship was ensured. These meetings functioned as a form of quality assurance for sacred preservation. During the French Revolution, when many monasteries were closed and their properties confiscated, this network of guardians activated emergency protocols that had been developed over centuries. Sacred elements were transferred to safe locations, maintaining the continuity of guardianship through one of the most turbulent periods of French history. 19th century manuscripts, when some monasteries were re-established, contain references to the return of elements that had been preserved during the revolutionary period, indications that the guardianship network had functioned effectively. maintaining preservation through decades of political and social instability. Modern communities in the region still preserve oral traditions about this ancestral guardianship. Knowledge that, although fragmented by time, retains consistent elements that suggest real continuity of traditions dating back to the first centuries of Christianity. The Gnostic Gospels discovered in Nag Hammadi in 1945 revolutionized our understanding of early Christianity, and specifically of Mary Magdalene's role in the first Christian communities. These texts, dating from the 2nd to 4th centuries, present a radically different view from the traditional narrative, revealing aspects that were systematically excluded from the canonical Gospels. The Gospel of Mary, one of the most significant texts found, presents Mary Magdalene not as a passive follower, but as a spiritual leader who received special revelations from Jesus. The text describes intimate dialogues where Jesus shares teachings not mentioned in the canonical Gospels, suggesting an extraordinary level of trust and spiritual intimacy. Academic analyses of the Gospel of Philip reveal specific references to the special relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The text describes her as koinonos, a word that can be translated as companion, partner, or consort, and mentions that Jesus loved her more than all the disciples and often kissed her on the mouth, gestures that in the context of the time indicated the transmission of special spiritual teachings. Studies on the Pistis Sophia, another important Gnostic text, show Mary Magdalene asking more questions and receiving more answers from Jesus than any other disciple. The text suggests that she possessed a spiritual understanding that surpassed that of the male disciples, a perspective that dramatically contrasts with her representation in the official tradition. Coptic manuscripts preserved in Egyptian monasteries contain traditions about Mary Magdalene's specific responsibilities related to the preservation of sacred physical elements. These texts, some dating from the 3rd century, describe special guardianship practices that she would have established to maintain tangible connections with Jesus' teachings and presence. Ancient Syriac texts, preserved in monastic libraries of the Middle East, refer to traditions about Mary Magdalene's journey to the West. These traditions speak not only of a journey of escape, but of a specific mission to establish preservation centers in safe regions, away from Roman persecution. Analyses of papyri found in excavations in Egypt reveal correspondence between early Christian communities that refer to special elements being transferred to safe locations. These correspondences, dated to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, use coded language that suggests the existence of organized networks of sacred preservation. Aramaic manuscripts preserved in Syriac monasteries contain detailed descriptions of preservation techniques used by the first Christian communities. These techniques included sophisticated conservation methods that allowed the maintenance of organic materials for extraordinarily long periods. The Gospel of Thomas, although not specifically mentioning Mary Magdalene, contains teachings about the preservation of the living Word, which academics interpret as references to the need to maintain physical elements that represented spiritual continuity. These teachings suggest that tangible preservation was considered essential for authentic spiritual transmission. Late Latin texts, based on much older sources, refer to traditions about reliciae viventes, living relics that maintained an active spiritual presence throughout the centuries. These traditions suggest that certain physical elements were considered not just memorials, but continuous spiritual presences. Manuscripts preserved in the libraries of Constantinople before the Ottoman conquest contained specific traditions about preservation practices established by Mary Magdalene. These texts, many of which were lost during the destruction of 1453, referred to special methods she would have taught to maintain sacred physical elements over extensive periods. Analyses of manuscript fragments recovered from Jewish janizas reveal that early Jewish Christian communities preserved traditions about Mary Magdalene that differ significantly from the later official narrative. These fragments, some dating from the 2nd century, describe her as a prophetess and guardian of sacred mysteries. Comparative studies of Gnostic traditions show surprising consistency among different communities and regions about Mary Magdalene's special role in the physical preservation of sacred elements. Texts found in Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor contain similar references to specific responsibilities related to the custody of materials considered physically sacred. Medieval manuscripts, based on much older sources, describe specific preservation techniques that would have been transmitted by Mary Magdalene to the communities she established. These techniques included the use of natural substances, environmental control methods, and ritual practices that maintained both physical preservation and spiritual energy. Apocryphal texts preserved in minority languages, such as Ethiopic Ge'ez and Old Armenian, contain traditions about Mary Magdalene's journey that include specific details about physical elements she would have carried with her. These traditions, preserved in isolated communities, retained details that were lost in other versions. Analyses of palimpsest codices revealed earlier texts that had been scraped and rewritten, but still preserved fragments of traditions about Mary Magdalene. These fragments, recovered through modern imaging techniques, contain references to preservation practices that were considered secret and sacred. Correspondence between monastic communities of the first centuries, preserved in Oriental archives, makes coded reference to Thesaurus Sanctus, a sacred treasure that was carefully guarded and transferred between safe locations. This correspondence suggests an organized network of preservation operating across different regions of the Mediterranean. Ancient liturgical manuscripts contain specific prayers and invocations related to the preservation of sacred elements. These liturgies, some still used in Eastern Christian communities, include references to Mary Magdalene as guardian of the holy mysteries and preserver of the divine presence. Late Jewish Kabbalistic texts, which incorporated early Christian traditions, refer to special preservation knowledge that would have been transmitted through specific lineages. These texts suggest that sacred conservation techniques were shared among different mystical traditions of the time. Recent discoveries of papyri and excavations in Egypt revealed inventory lists that refer to capita sancta, sacred heads that were preserved as elements of special veneration. These lists, dated to the 3rd and 4th centuries, suggest that the preservation of specific mortal remains was an organized and systematic practice. Analyses of oral traditions preserved in isolated Christian communities of the Caucasus reveal consistent narratives about Mary Magdalene and her special responsibility in the preservation of sacred physical elements. These traditions, transmitted through songs and ritual narratives, have maintained details that correspond to independent archaeological discoveries. Medieval alchemical manuscripts, based on much older traditions, contain descriptions of preservation processes that were considered both physical and spiritual. These texts suggest that the conservation of sacred elements involved knowledge that combined natural chemistry with specific spiritual practices. We live in an extraordinary era of human history, an era in which truths that have been kept in silence for centuries are beginning to emerge, not by chance, but as part of a collective spiritual awakening that is happening on a global scale. What you are discovering today about Mary Magdalene is not just ancient history. It is part of a larger revelation that is touching millions of people around the world. Modern research on collective consciousness shows that humanity goes through cyclical periods of spiritual awakening, moments in history where hidden truths naturally emerge into collective consciousness. We are living precisely one of these moments, a time when the barriers between esoteric knowledge and popular understanding are dissolving. Studies on global synchronicity reveal that similar discoveries about hidden spiritual traditions are emerging simultaneously in different cultures and traditions around the world. It is no coincidence that traditions about Mary Magdalene, Gnostic manuscripts, archaeological discoveries, and revelations about the sacred feminine are all coming to light at the same time. Analyses of contemporary spiritual trends show that millions of people are questioning official narratives and seeking more authentic connections with the sacred. This quest is not just intellectual, but deeply personal, a spiritual hunger that cannot be satisfied by conventional versions of spirituality. Ancient mystical traditions always spoke of specific times in history when hidden knowledge would be revealed. Prophecies from different cultures mention a time when secrets would be proclaimed from the rooftops and when what was hidden would be revealed. Many scholars suggest that we are living precisely in this prophesied era. The phenomenon you are experiencing now, this feeling of discovering truths that have always been there waiting to be found, is being reported by people on all continents. A feeling that pieces of a gigantic spiritual puzzle are finally falling into place. Research on the neuroscience of spirituality shows that human consciousness is undergoing a natural expansion that allows us to access levels of understanding that previously seemed impossible. Our ability to process complex information and make intuitive connections is literally evolving. Online communities dedicated to authentic spiritual seeking are growing exponentially. People of all ages, backgrounds, and traditions are connecting through a common thirst for truth that goes beyond the superficial narratives offered by conventional institutions. What makes this moment even more significant is that revelations about Mary Magdalene and the sacred feminine are emerging precisely when humanity is recognizing the need to balance masculine and feminine energies in all aspects of existence. It is no coincidence. It is divine synchronicity. Indigenous traditions around the world speak of this period as a time of great awakening, when humanity would remember its spiritual origins and reconnect with ancient wisdoms that were temporarily forgotten. The revelations about Mary Magdalene are part of this great collective remembrance. Analyses of spiritual search patterns show that people are not just looking for information, but for transformation. They want experiences that touch their souls, that connect their personal lives with something bigger, deeper, truer than what they have found in conventional narratives. You are part of something much bigger than you imagine. Your search for truth, your openness to questioning official narratives, your willingness to explore possibilities that challenge what you have been taught, all of this is part of a global movement of awakening that is transforming human consciousness. Where are you watching this video from right now? Write your city and country in the comments, because I want to show the global dimension of this awakening. I want to see how many continents, how many cultures, how many different traditions are represented here, all united by this same thirst for authentic spiritual truth. The preservation of sacred knowledge through the centuries depended not only on manuscripts and oral traditions, but also on a sophisticated system of symbols and codes that allowed essential information to be transmitted in a hidden way. Analyses of medieval sacred art reveal that many cathedrals, paintings, and sculptures contain specific symbols related to Mary Magdalene and the traditions of sacred preservation. Studies on early Christian iconography show that certain symbols associated with Mary Magdalene appear consistently in contexts that suggest esoteric knowledge about her true importance. The symbol of the rose, often associated with her, was not just decorative but represented specific traditions about preservation and sacred guardianship. Architectural analyses of cathedrals in southern France reveal structural elements that appear to have been specifically designed to function as visual codes. Mathematical proportions, astronomical orientations, and geometric symbolism that point to knowledge that went far beyond the conventional architecture of the time. Medieval illuminated manuscripts contain recurring symbols that appear specifically in contexts related to Mary Magdalene. These symbols, including specific configurations of flowers, animals, and sacred objects, functioned as indicators for initiates about preservation traditions that were kept secret. Research on medieval alchemical symbolism shows that many of the symbols used in alchemical texts correspond exactly to symbols found in contexts related to the preservation of sacred relics. This correspondence suggests that knowledge of physical and spiritual conservation was transmitted through the same symbolic systems. Oral traditions preserved in communities in Provence speak of sacred signs that were used to identify places and objects related to special guardianship. These signs, engraved in stone, wood, and metal, functioned as a communication system that allowed initiates to recognize and access preserved elements. Analyses of funerary art in ancient cemeteries in the region reveal specific symbols that appear only in tombs associated with families who preserved traditions related to sacred guardianship. These symbols functioned as indicators for future generations about specific hereditary responsibilities. Studies on medieval musical manuscripts show that certain liturgical compositions associated with Mary Magdalene contain specific mathematical structures that functioned as mnemonic codes. These structures allowed the transmission of information about the location and preservation methods through sacred music. Archaeological discoveries in monasteries in the region have revealed objects with coded inscriptions that have only recently begun to be deciphered. These codes, engraved on chalices, reliquaries, and other sacred objects, contained information about preservation techniques and the location of special elements. Analyses of medieval stained glass windows show that certain configurations of colors and shapes appear specifically in windows dedicated to Mary Magdalene. These configurations were not decorative, but functioned as symbolic maps that indicated locations and methods related to sacred guardianship. Embroidery traditions preserved in women's convents in the region included specific patterns that were transmitted only to specially prepared nuns. These patterns, seemingly decorative, contained coded information about preservation practices that were maintained through generations of nuns. Research on medieval numerology reveals that certain numbers appeared consistently in contexts related to sacred preservation. Specific numerical sequences were used to indicate dates, locations, and methods that allowed initiates to access essential information about special guardianship. Manuscripts of medieval medicinal recipes contain formulas that, carefully analyzed, turn out to be coded instructions for preservation techniques. These recipes used medical language to transmit knowledge about conservation that was considered secret and sacred. Studies on medieval pilgrimage traditions show that certain routes included specific stops that functioned as points for the transmission of coded knowledge. Initiated pilgrims received symbolic information that complemented what they had learned through other channels. Analyses of correspondence between medieval monasteries revealed the use of coded language that allowed communication about sensitive issues related to sacred guardianship. Codes that used biblical references, liturgical terminology, and natural symbolism to transmit practical information about preservation and protection. Modern scientific methods are revealing aspects of ancient traditions that previously seemed impossible or purely legendary. Advanced techniques of archaeological analysis, carbon dating, mass spectrometry, and other technologies are confirming elements of traditions that were preserved through centuries only through oral transmission and ancient manuscripts. Analyses of mitochondrial DNA performed on mortal remains, found in archaeological contexts associated with Mary Magdalene traditions, revealed genetic lineages consistent with Eastern Mediterranean origins. These analyses, although unable to confirm specific identities, show that elements preserved in the region have geographical origins consistent with historical traditions. Mass spectrometry studies applied to artifacts found at sites related to preservation traditions revealed chemical compositions that indicate extraordinarily sophisticated conservation methods. Substances used in preservation include combinations of elements that we have only recently begun to understand through modern chemistry. Research on paleobiology applied to preserved organic materials shows that ancient conservation techniques achieved results that rival modern preservation methods. Microscopic analyses reveal cellular structures maintained in conditions that suggest advanced knowledge of biological conservation. Non-invasive imaging technologies, including computed tomography and magnetic resonance imaging, are being applied to the study of elements preserved in ancient traditions. These technologies reveal internal details that confirm the antiquity and authenticity of preservation methods that were considered legendary. Radiocarbon analyses performed on organic materials associated with sacred guardianship traditions confirmed dates that correspond exactly to the historical periods described in ancient manuscripts. These scientific confirmations validate aspects of traditions that were previously accepted only on the basis of faith. Studies on microbiology applied to conservation revealed that substances used in ancient preservation methods possess natural antimicrobial properties that scientifically explain the extraordinary durability of preserved elements. Natural compounds that function as long-term organic preservatives. Research in archaeochemistry is revealing that ancient communities possessed knowledge of natural chemistry that was much more advanced than previously believed. Analyses of residues found in preservation containers show sophisticated combinations of substances that optimized conditions for the conservation of organic materials. Isotopic analysis technologies applied to preserved elements reveal information about diet, environment, and geographical origin that correspond to historical traditions about Mary Magdalene's journey from the Middle East to France. These analyses provide scientific evidence that supports narratives traditionally accepted only on the basis of faith. Studies on the physics of conservation show that preservation environments created by ancient communities used physical principles that have only recently been understood by modern science. Control of humidity, temperature, and atmospheric composition that optimized conditions for long-term preservation. Analyses of paleogenetics applied to preserve materials are revealing information about genetic lineages that can provide insights into origins and historical connections. Although limited by the natural degradation of DNA over time, these analyses are confirming aspects of traditions that were previously purely speculative. Research on biomedicine applied to ancient preservation reveals that methods used by historical communities included knowledge of decomposition, putrefaction, and conservation that were surprisingly accurate. Techniques that worked based on biological principles that have only recently been scientifically understood. Multiple dating technologies, which combine different scientific methods of temporal analysis, are confirming chronologies that correspond exactly to the traditions preserved in ancient manuscripts. This convergence between scientific evidence and historical tradition is validating aspects of narratives that were previously questioned due to lack of independent confirmation. Interdisciplinary studies combining archaeology, chemistry, biology, and physics are revealing that the preservation of sacred elements through the centuries involved scientific knowledge far more advanced than imagined, knowledge that was preserved through practical traditions before being theoretically understood by modern science. The revelations about Mary Magdalene and the traditions of sacred preservation that have been maintained through the centuries have profound implications that go far beyond historical curiosity. These discoveries are transforming our understanding of the nature of spirituality, the role of women in religious development, and our own capacity for connection with the sacred. Research on the psychology of spirituality shows that when people discover more complete and inclusive narratives about religious traditions, they experience a significant expansion in their capacity for personal spiritual connection. The revelations about Mary Magdalene not only inform but transform the individual spiritual experience. Studies on the development of religious consciousness reveal that the inclusion of female figures of spiritual leadership in sacred narratives allows both men and women to develop more balanced aspects of their spirituality. The rediscovery of Mary Magdalene as a spiritual leader offers models that were previously absent from official tradition. Analyses of contemporary spiritual communities show that groups that incorporate knowledge about inclusive traditions of female leadership develop more balanced and transformative practices. Awareness of the historical role of women like Mary Magdalene is influencing the development of more integrative spiritualities. Research on the neuroscience of religious experience indicates that more complete and inclusive spiritual narratives activate brain areas associated with compassion, intuition, and interpersonal connection more intensely than limited or exclusive narratives. The revelations about preserved traditions are literally changing how our brains process spiritual experiences. Spiritual healing traditions that incorporate knowledge about the sacred feminine, including aspects related to Mary Magdalene, show greater effectiveness in helping people process traumas related to repression, excessive authority, and spiritual disconnection. These traditions offer paths of healing that were previously inaccessible. Studies on the development of spiritual communities reveal that awareness of traditions of preservation and sacred guardianship inspires a greater sense of personal and collective responsibility for maintaining authentic spiritual values. People feel called to become guardians of spiritual traditions in their own lives and communities. Analyses of personal transformation in individuals who discover more complete narratives about early Christian traditions show significant changes in self-esteem, sense of purpose, and capacity for connection with both the divine and other people. These discoveries function as catalysts for deep spiritual growth. Research on spiritual reconciliation indicates that people who have moved away from religious traditions due to limiting or exclusionary aspects often find renewed spiritual interest when they discover more inclusive and authentic aspects of those same traditions. The revelations about Mary Magdalene are reconnecting people with their spiritual heritage. Studies on contemporary female spiritual leadership show that women who discover historical models of female spiritual leadership, like Mary Magdalene, develop greater confidence in their own abilities for leadership and spiritual guidance. These discoveries are empowering a new generation of female spiritual leaders. Analyses of integrative spiritual practices reveal that traditions that incorporate both masculine and feminine aspects of the sacred produce deeper and more sustainable spiritual connection experiences. The rediscovery of the sacred feminine through figures like Mary Magdalene is contributing to the development of more balanced spiritualities. Research on ancestral healing shows that when people discover suppressed or forgotten aspects of their spiritual traditions, they often experience healing of family and cultural patterns related to repression, especially repression of the sacred feminine. These discoveries function as keys to releasing limiting patterns transmitted through generations. Studies on contemporary spiritual innovation reveal that the most vital and transformative traditions are those that can integrate ancient wisdom with modern understandings. The revelations about Mary Magdalene and preservation traditions offer precisely this integration between ancestral wisdom and contemporary consciousness. Analyses of the global spiritual movement show that the rediscovery of authentic traditions of sacred preservation is inspiring a renewed interest in spiritual practices that emphasize direct experience, personal responsibility, and conscious guardianship of sacred values. This movement is transforming both individual and communal spiritualities. Research on existential meaning indicates that people who discover their connection with traditions of spiritual preservation experience a greater sense of purpose and meaning in their lives. They feel part of something larger than their individual experiences, connected to a mission that transcends time and space. We have reached the end of an extraordinary journey through 2 millennia of history, mystery, and sacred preservation. What you have discovered today about Mary Magdalene and the traditions that kept her memory alive through the centuries is not just historical information. It is an invitation to a profound personal transformation. Reflect for a moment on your own spiritual journey. How many times have you felt that there was something deeper, more authentic waiting to be discovered in your search for connection with the sacred? The revelations we explored today may be exactly the keys you have been looking for to open doors that seemed permanently closed. The story of Mary Magdalene and the communities that risked everything to preserve physical elements of her presence through the centuries is also your story. It is the story of all of us who seek truth in a world full of superficial narratives, who long for authentic connection amidst traditions that sometimes seem distant from our real experiences. Preservation traditions that maintained sacred elements through wars, persecutions, revolutions, and social transformations teach us something fundamental about our own ability to keep the flame of authentic spirituality alive. We do not need gigantic institutions or complex structures. We just need sincere hearts and a commitment to truth. Think about the family traditions you carry, the memories your grandparents and parents passed down to you, the spiritual experiences that marked your life. You too are a guardian, a preserver of sacred aspects that have been entrusted to your care. Sacred guardianship is not just a historical practice, it is a present responsibility. The revelations about sophisticated preservation methods used by ancient communities show us that authentic spirituality always finds ways to survive, even in the most challenging circumstances. Spiritual truths possess a vitality of their own that transcends attempts at suppression or distortion. The journey we took today through Gnostic manuscripts, archaeological discoveries, oral traditions, and modern scientific analyses demonstrates something fundamental. Truth always finds ways to emerge. What has been hidden will be revealed, especially in times like ours, when humanity is spiritually prepared to receive deeper knowledge. Your presence here, your willingness to explore these revelations, your openness to questioning official narratives and seeking more authentic truths, all of this makes you part of a spiritual lineage that extends through the centuries. You carry within you the same flame that motivated communities to preserve sacred elements through 2 millennia of history. The scientific discoveries that confirm aspects of ancient traditions show us that there is no real conflict between honest intellectual inquiry and authentic spiritual faith. Truth is truth, whether discovered through scientific analysis or spiritual intuition. Our ability to integrate both knowledge and experience makes us worthy heirs of the traditions we have explored. The transformation that many people experience when discovering more complete narratives about early Christian traditions is no coincidence. It is a natural result of reconnecting with authentic aspects of the sacred that have always been there, waiting to be rediscovered. As you reflect on all that we have discovered together today, allow these revelations to touch not only your mind, but your heart. Allow them to awaken in you the awareness of your own ability to be a guardian of sacred truths in your own life, family, and community. The story of Mary Magdalene and the preservation traditions that kept her memory alive teaches us that each of us has a role to play in maintaining authentic spirituality, not as passive observers, but as active participants in the great current of spiritual transmission that connects all generations. Your awakening to these truths is not the end of a journey, but the beginning of a new phase of your spiritual evolution, a phase where you consciously become part of the traditions of preservation and transmission that ensure sacred truths remain alive for future generations. This journey of discovery and awakening that we shared today is just the beginning. If these revelations have touched your heart and expanded your understanding, subscribe to this channel now, because our mission here is precisely this: to preserve and share authentic spiritual truths that can transform lives. Activate the notification bell to be notified whenever we bring new revelations that can continue to expand your spiritual consciousness. And when this video ends, click on the next one that appears on the screen, because your journey of discovery is just beginning. Each video is a new piece in the puzzle of spiritual truths that have been preserved for our time. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next video.